In October 1877, the United States Army held a full military burial at West Point for General George Armstrong Custer. Bands played, officers saluted, thousands attended. It was, by every account, a moment of national closure. There is one problem. The officer who led the retrieval mission, the man who physically collected those bones from a Montana battlefield, wrote in private correspondence that same month that he was not confident he had recovered the right remains. That letter has been sitting in the historical record for nearly 150 years. No one in an official capacity has ever meaningfully responded to it. This is an investigation into what actually happened to the body of George Armstrong Custer from the moment he was found on a Montana hillside to the grave that may or may not contain him today. The evidence is incomplete. The witnesses contradict each other, and the institution with the most authority to resolve the question has chosen consistently not to. The first piece of evidence is the condition of the body itself. When General Terry's column arrived at the battlefield on June 27, 1876, 2 days after the fighting, they were searching for identifiable remains among more than 200 dead. The heat had been working on those bodies since the 25th. The scouts and officers who moved through the field described what they found in field reports and personal letters that have since been collected and archived. Their accounts establish several things. First, the scale of the mutilation was severe and widespread. The warriors who returned to the battlefield after the battle had stripped, disemboweled, and dismembered the majority of the soldiers. Multiple witnesses described heads removed, eyes gouged, and organs displaced. These were not random acts. Several accounts describe the mutilations as selective and deliberate. Certain bodies had clearly been treated differently than others, and this is where the evidence becomes unusual. Custer's body was different. Lieutenant Edward Godfrey noted in his journal that Custer appeared comparatively unmutilated compared to the men around him. He had 2 gunshot wounds, one in the chest and one in the left temple. There was also a knife slash on the left thigh, and the tip of one finger had been severed. But beyond that, the body had been left largely intact. There was no scalping, no decapitation, no removal of organs. In a field where most officers had been mutilated extensively, Custer's condition stood out. This creates the first major question: why? There was another detail reported by multiple witnesses. Someone had driven a sewing awl, a pointed leather-piercing tool, deep into each of Custer's ears. Both ear canals had been pierced. The act was deliberate. And that detail tells us something important. Whoever performed this act knew who Custer was. You do not perform a targeted ritual on an unidentified body. The meaning of this act appears in Cheyenne oral tradition. Years before the Battle of Little Bighorn, Custer had met with Southern Cheyenne leaders and made a promise not to make war on their people again. He later broke that promise at the Washita River in 1868 when his troops attacked a winter village at dawn. Men, women, and children were killed. According to Cheyenne accounts recorded later, the awls placed in Custer's ears were symbolic punishment. They were meant to ensure that in the afterlife he would hear the promises he had made and broken. Punishment like that requires identification, which means that at some point on that hillside, someone knew exactly whose body they were dealing with. This leads directly into the second mystery. Why was Custer not scalped? There are 3 different explanations in the historical record. The first explanation is the simplest. Before the campaign, Custer had cut his hair short. The famous golden curls seen in his photographs were gone. Some historians argue that this made him harder to recognize among hundreds of bodies scattered across the battlefield. Without his distinctive hair, he may have appeared to be just another fallen soldier. But this explanation has a problem. If Custer was not recognized, then the ritual, involving the Alls makes no sense. Someone clearly identified him, which means the unrecognized theory does not fully explain the evidence. The second explanation comes from Cheyenne oral tradition. In the 1890s, ethnographer George Grinnell interviewed Cheyenne elders who had been present at the battle. According to their accounts, a Cheyenne woman walking among the bodies recognized Custer. Some versions describe her as a relative of Chief Stone Forehead, whose band had been attacked at Washita. She is said to have performed the ear-piercing ritual herself. And according to the account, she also made a deliberate decision not to allow Custer's scalp to be taken. Her reasoning was simple. A scalp was considered a warrior's trophy. Taking Custer's scalp would acknowledge that he had died with a warrior's honor. She refused to give him that recognition. This explanation matches the physical evidence. It explains both the ritual and the intact hair. But like all oral histories recorded decades later, it cannot be independently verified. There is also a third possibility suggested by some historians. In this version, the events happened in sequence. Immediately after the battle, Custer's body may not have been recognized. Later, when warriors returned to the battlefield, someone identified him. The ear-piercing ritual was then performed. By that time, his hair had already been left untouched. Once he was recognized, that decision may have been preserved intentionally. This theory attempts to reconcile both explanations, but the evidence cannot fully confirm it. What the historical record can say is this: the ritual performed on Custer's body strongly suggests that he was recognized, and the absence of scalping appears to have been a deliberate decision rather than an accident. But the mystery surrounding Custer's body did not end on the battlefield. In many ways, it began there. When General Terry's men buried their dead, they were working under extreme conditions. More than 200 bodies had been lying in the summer heat for 2 days. There were no coffins and very little equipment. The soldiers buried their comrades as quickly as possible. Most graves were shallow. Some were little more than depressions in the earth. Custer received a slightly deeper grave, wrapped in canvas and marked with a wooden stake. But the conditions of the battlefield meant these graves would not remain undisturbed for long. Reports from travelers and scouts in the months after the battle describe animals digging into the shallow graves. Bones were exposed. Markers were knocked over or destroyed. By the following year, many of the burial sites had been badly disturbed. In July 1877, Captain Henry Nowlin returned to the battlefield with orders to recover Custer's remains and transport them east. But he was no longer retrieving a preserved body from a marked grave. He was trying to identify a skeleton within a field of scattered and disturbed remains. In letters written shortly after the mission, Nowlin admitted that the graves had been heavily disrupted. Identification relied mostly on the approximate location of Custer's grave marker and a few nearby artifacts. Even Nowlin described the identification as the best determination possible under the circumstances. The remains believed to be Custer's were then transported east. On October 10, 1877, they were buried at West Point with full military honors. But the question of whether those bones actually belonged to Custer has never completely disappeared. One reason involves his height. Custer stood around 5 feet 11 inches tall. Several observers present at the burial noted that the skeleton appeared shorter than expected. These were informal observations, not scientific measurements, but the discrepancy was noted more than once. Another issue involves the proximity of other graves. Custer had been buried near several of his soldiers. After a year of animal activity and disturbed earth, bones from multiple graves may have been mixed together. Historian Lawrence Frost later examined the exhumation records and concluded that the remains sent to West Point may have belonged to another cavalryman buried nearby, possibly a corporal named John Dozier. Frost's theory has never been officially disproven. It has simply never been tested. Modern DNA analysis could settle the question. By comparing DNA from the West Point remains with known descendants of the Custer family, historians could confirm whether the skeleton actually belongs to him. But such testing has never been conducted. The grave at West Point remains officially accepted as Custer's final resting place. And so, the mystery remains. The evidence suggests that Custer was recognized on the battlefield, that a ritual punishment was carried out against him, and that the decision not to scalp him may have been a deliberate act of denial. But the bones buried at West Point may not belong to him at all. If that is true, the real remains of George Armstrong Custer may still lie somewhere on the hills above the Little Bighorn, unidentified, unmarked, and lost among the soldiers who died under his command. The technology to answer this question has existed for decades. The test has simply never been done. And that leaves one final question. If you had the authority to settle the mystery once and for all, would you open the grave?